Most people think they know this story. The Highland Clearances. Whole communities burned out of their homes. Gaelic culture crushed. The Highlands emptied so sheep could take their place. So here's the blunt question. Were the Highland Clearances a form of genocide or cold-blooded economic modernisation? You'll hear people say English landlords destroyed Scottish culture on purpose, that it was a deliberate attempt to wipe the Highlanders off the map. But when you actually look at the population, the emigration records, and the money involved, a different picture starts to appear. By the end of this episode, you'll see why the truth is more complicated than either simple story. It wasn't a heroic last stand, and it wasn't an organised genocide either. It was something messier, and in some ways, even more uncomfortable. Stay with me. Let's start with the story most of us have grown up with. In the popular version, the Highland Clearances look like a deliberate campaign of destruction. You've got ruthless, often English or anglicised landlords sneering at their Gaelic tenants. They decide the people are useless and systematically drive them off the land, burning homes, smashing communities, and deliberately destroying Highland culture. In this narrative, every clearance is violent. Cottages set on fire, soldiers dragging families out, old people dying by the roadside, ships crammed with exiles sent across the ocean, never to return. TV dramas, novels, and tourist myths lean hard into this. The Highlands become a tragic victim of intentional cultural extermination. You'll even hear phrases like ethnic cleansing or genocide of the Gaels thrown around. And you can see why that sticks. It's emotionally powerful. It makes sense of real trauma, families torn from land they'd farmed for generations, a language pushed to the margins, and empty glens where there used to be smoke rising from hundreds of hearths. It also fits a simple good versus evil story. Villains, greedy landlords often labelled English or lowland elites. Victims, noble Highlanders, loyal, brave, and wronged. Motive, pure hatred of a people and their culture. The problem is, that story is compelling, but it's incomplete, and in some ways, misleading. To see what really happened, we need to do something very un-YouTube. Talk about profit, population, and property law. First big question. If this was a genocide, what was the motive supposed to be? Because when you look at what actually happened to the land after people were cleared, one thing stands out. The glens weren't left empty as some kind of dead zone. They were reorganised and turned into large sheep farms. From the late 18th century into the 19th, the Highlands were pulled into a wider shift in agricultural happening across Britain and much of Europe. Small subsistence plots were being consolidated. Land was being run for profit, not just survival. Landlords were under pressure to turn estates into businesses, not just status symbols. In the Highlands, that new business model meant sheep. Sheep produced wool for export. They needed far fewer workers than scattered tenant families. And on paper, they brought in far more money than traditional low-rent, small-scale farming. So instead of hundreds of families paying modest rents and scraping by, you could have a handful of shepherds, a big flock, and a steady income from wool. That doesn't make landlords sympathetic. Many were still ruthless, out of touch, or just plain cruel. But their main motive looks far more like economic calculation than ethnic hatred. Then there's a population question. If it was genocide in the strict sense, an attempt to wipe out a people, you'd expect to see the Highland population collapse and never recover. Instead, what you see is more complicated. Some areas lose people dramatically, especially inland glens and some islands. Other areas, especially coastal strips and new crofting communities, actually end up more crowded for a while, as people are shoved onto smaller, poorer plots. Overall, Highlanders don't simply vanish. The population shifts, but it doesn't just disappear overnight. So if this was meant to be a clean extermination of a people, it was bizarrely badly executed, and suspiciously good at turning land into money. In other words, it looks less like destroy the Highlanders because we hate them, and more like sheep are a better business model than people. But hold on, because when you follow where the people actually went, another twist appears. Yes, there were brutal evictions. Yes, some people were forced onto boats. But in the records, you also find assisted emigration schemes and families who, faced with a grim future on tiny scraps of land, actually chose to leave. So here's the paradox. If this was only about kicking people out, why do we see so many Highlanders taking the chance to go abroad? To answer that, we need to look at emigration and demographics. From the late 1700s into the 1800s, Scotland became one of the most emigration-heavy countries in Europe. Tens of thousands of people left over the clearance period. Many of them came from the Highlands. Some were pushed. Some felt they had no real choice. Others looked at their options and decided a risky voyage overseas was still better than guaranteed poverty at home. Where did they go? To growing industrial towns in Central Belt, Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh, looking for work in factories, shipyards and docks, to North America, especially Canada, to Australia and New Zealand as new colonies opened up, land and opportunities. In many cases, landlords actively encouraged this, paying towards passage on the condition that tenants didn't come back. Now, assisted emigration sounds softer than it really was. In reality, the choice for many families looked like stay in the Highlands on a tiny, exhausted patch of land that can barely grow anything, or accept a one-way ticket to a place you've never seen. Is that truly voluntary? Morally, it's murky as hell, but it shows this wasn't always soldiers at the door or nothing. There's another factor too, potato blight. In the 1840s, the potato crop failed in parts of the Highlands, just as it did in Ireland. That hit communities who were already living on the edge, often pushed onto poorer land by earlier clearances. But the overall outcome was different from Ireland's catastrophe. Scotland still saw hunger, hardship and deaths, but instead of mass death on an Irish scale, the main solution became movement. Most people left for towns or emigrated. Some relief came in, patchy and often too late. The crisis accelerated changes that was already underway. So what you end up with is less are people starved into extinction and more are people pushed outwards into cities and across the world. Over the long term, some Highland districts do empty out or decline sharply. Others linger on with ageing, shrinking populations. But Highlanders don't stop existing. They show up again as workers in Glasgow and other Scottish towns, settlers and soldiers in Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand. Part of big diaspora communities that still talk about the Highlands generations later. So demographically, this isn't a clean story of extermination, it's a story of displacement and dispersal. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, Tam, so maybe it wasn't genocide in the technical sense, but people were still burned out of their homes. Does any of this economic and demographic stuff actually make it less brutal? No. And this is important. Explaining is not excusing. There were genuinely horrific episodes during the clearances. Roofs deliberately set on fire so people couldn't move back in. Whole townships emptied in a single day, the elderly and the sick left with nowhere else to go. People herded onto marginal land along the coasts where survival depends on fishing, kelp, or sheer luck. Even when removals were negotiated, the power balance was totally one-sided. The landlord held the legal title. The tenant had almost no formal protection. So yes, even if the main motive was profit rather than extermination, the human cost was enormous. Communities shattered, families split between continents, Gaelic language and culture weakened in its heartlands, even as parts of it survived in diaspora. That's one reason why some people reach for the word genocide today. They're trying to express just how devastating it was. But when you look at the pattern as a whole, you don't see a state or a ruling class drawing up a plan to physically wipe out Highlanders because of who they were. What you see is a ruling class chasing higher profits, a legal system that almost entirely favoured property owners, a wider European trend of turning traditional rural societies into commercial agriculture, and Highlanders caught at the sharpest, most brutal end of that process. So the honest view is, it was tragic and unjust, but it sits in a different category from events that were openly designed as extermination. So where does that leave us? Let's go back to the original question. Were the Highland Clearances genocide or economics? Based on the evidence, the best answer is complicated economic modernisation with a tragic human cost. When you step back, a few things become clear. The Highland population in some areas falls sharply, but the people as a group don't just vanish. They move, they migrate, they have children elsewhere. Large-scale sheep farming and commercial agriculture were more profitable than keeping lots of small tenants, and the profit motive drove most of the decisions. Emigration wasn't just people dragged in chains. Many left under intense pressure, but with assisted passage and hopes of a better life abroad. The whole process operated within a property system that overwhelmingly backed landlords, not tenants. Similar patterns of clearing land and consolidating farms appear in other parts of Britain and Europe. The Highlands were a particularly harsh example of a wider trend, not a freak event. At the same time, many evictions were harsh, rushed, and indifferent to human suffering. Entire communities were broken up, language and culture took massive hits, even if they didn't die completely. So if you came into this video thinking the clearances were straightforward genocide, the overall pattern doesn't really support that. But if you came in thinking it was just progress, nothing to see here, that's just as wrong. The reality is uglier and less satisfying. The Highland Clearances were what happens when economic modernisation, legal power, and human lives collide. And the people at the bottom of the system don't get a say. So where does that leave us as modern Scots or descendants of Scots looking back? I'd argue it leaves us with a double responsibility. First, to recognise how much pain, loss and dislocation the clearances caused. Second, to understand the evidence well enough not to flatten that story into an easy slogan. If you've made it this far in the Scotland Uncover series, thank you. But we're not done with Scotland's messy past yet. For a potential Season 2, we've got some big questions on the table. How much Viking is really in Scottish DNA culture? Who were the medieval Scottish queens? History quietly pushed to the side. And what's the truth behind the real Macbeth? King, tyrant, or victim of Shakespeare's PR machine? Let me know in the comments which mystery you want us to tackle next. If this helped you see the clearances differently, hit like so YouTube actually shows it to someone else. I'm Tam, this is Fiction Foundry, and as always, let's keep forging the truth.